As you guys know,
in this video, Myron explains the 4 things America has to worry about for the future to come. He talks about the reserve currency, SWIFT, military power, and the different things that's going to lead to America's demise. If you guys like this content, hit a like and subscribe.
I am a non-interventionist. I am not a fan of intervening in foreign affairs, and I am not a fan of, quite frankly, what we're running right now, which is gunboat diplomacy, okay, with what we did in Venezuela. And the reason why is because what you guys need to understand, right, and this is going to be a very ugly truth, but Americans need to understand this, okay? We are no longer in a unipolar world, okay? Back after World War II, the United States emerged as the world power, okay, as the only world power, really, right? Winston Churchill gave a famous speech where he declared the United States as the pinnacle of world power, right? This is after our show of force in World War II with the use of the atomic bomb, which no one really had access to back then. But our adversaries, China, Russia, etc., quickly caught up and also were able to get nuclear weapons. And the military edge that we once had, quickly started to dissipate over time. Now, without going into a bunch of history and everything else like that and putting you guys to sleep, let's go ahead and fast forward to where we are now. If you think that the invasion of Venezuela was for liberation of Venezuelan people or to combat and arrest a violent dictator / drug trafficker, well, you're an idiot. The real reason we invaded, which I think even the Trump administration admitted, was for the oil. But it's not just for the oil. You guys need to understand why it was for the oil. Okay? So let's go through this. The number one thing you guys need to understand is that the United States, our power is built on 4 primary pillars. These pillars are reserve currency status, the petrodollar, SWIFT, and our military might. These 4 elements, okay, are the reason why we have the ridiculous amount of leverage and power that we have in today's world. Okay? Go through that again. Reserve currency status, the petrodollar, SWIFT, and our military. Now, all 4 of these things are being challenged right now. Okay? Let's go first with the petrodollar. Last year in 2024, in June, Saudi Arabia decided to not renew its agreement to do all of its oil transactions in the US dollar. Okay? And basically, this hurts the power of the dollar because we struck a deal back in the 1970s under the Nixon administration where the Saudis would be protected by us in exchange for them doing all of their oil transactions in US dollars. Why is this important? The reason why this is important is because it forces other countries to do their oil transactions in US dollars. Everybody needs oil. And since everybody needs oil, everyone needs to hold US dollars. Since everyone needs to use US dollars, this puts us in a position where US dollars are always in demand. If US dollars are always in demand, that means that we are able to run deficit trading. We are able to do certain things that other countries aren't able to do. How do you guys think that we have almost 40 trillion in debt, yet we're now suffering economically? Have you guys ever thought about that for a second? How is it that we're able to do that? The reason why we're able to do that is because of the petrodollar and reserve currency status. This is what's called the Triffin dilemma, where if you are going to be the world's reserve currency like we currently are, you are always going to run into debt. Okay? So to be honest with you guys, this whole national debt, $40 trillion in debt, blah, 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 it's kind of unavoidable. Okay? And we've let it exceed quite a bit because of all the foreign wars in the Middle East. That's a whole other conversation. What you guys need to know for the purposes of this conversation is the US dollar is no longer backed by gold. Since the US dollar is no longer backed by gold, it was backed by the petrodollar. One of the reasons why it was backed. And the Saudis had agreed to do all their oil transactions in US dollars. This is important because it props up the US dollar. And it forces everyone to use the US dollar. Now, you guys are probably wondering, well, Myron, so you're telling me that we agreed to protect the Saudis in exchange for them? Well, explain this. What you guys need to understand about the Middle East is, in the Middle East, the biggest fear for any king, sultan, dictator, autocrat, whatever it is, their biggest fear is being overthrown. Okay? That's their biggest fear. As you guys can tell, Arab niggas, let's be honest, they're hard-headed. And I can tell you guys this as a fellow Arab. Okay? Niggas are hard-headed. They don't want to listen to nothing. So the biggest fear in any Muslim Arab majority country a lot of the times tends to be being overthrown. This is why Arab militaries always lose conflicts. I'll tell you why. Because they prioritize loyalty over competence. So let's say Muhammad is the dictator or the king. he'll put his buddy, Ahmed, as the head of the treasury. Well, the problem is that Ahmed never went to school. He could barely add. Okay? Then he makes his other buddy, Amir, all right, the head of the military. Well, he doesn't even know how to shoot a gun. Well, he's loyal. So what ends up happening is they favor loyalty over competence. This is why so many Arab militaries are weak and they lose all the time. You know, they're not competent. It is what it is. Niggas always take L's. It is what it is, right? So the Saudi Arabian government and the royal family is terrified of an uprising, being overthrown, etc. So the U.S. came in and said, look, we will guarantee your security. You will always be in power. Don't worry. But you just have to do oil transactions in dollars. Cool. And this is an agreement that lasted for decades, 50 years plus. One of the crazy things that Nixon was able to pull off. So that explains the petrodollar. Reserve currency status. Since the United States has a very strong military, we have rule of law, right? We have a democratic government. You know, things are just done a certain way, right? We have reserve currency status. This means what people do transactions all across the world, whether it's for commodities, global trade, etc., they use the US dollar. The US dollar is kind of the default instrument used to purchase commodities when it comes to international trade outside of the petrodollar. So the petrodollar is a component to reserve currency status, and obviously reserve currency status from commodities. This keeps dollars always in need, okay? Now, the majority of transactions used to be done by the US dollar, but now the US dollar accounts for something like 50 to 60% of global trade. Why? Because BRICS is rising up, okay? BRICS is, think of it as like a alliance between multiple emerging world powers that want to challenge the hegemon of the US dollar. Okay? Next is SWIFT. I'm going to make this very simple for you guys. SWIFT is basically this. Think of it as like a toll, right? In order for you to do a financial transaction, right, you must go through this toll. That toll is the SWIFT system, which is run by the United States. You want to do a financial transaction, you want to send money somewhere, etc., you got to go through this toll, which basically subjects you to the American financial system. Okay? That is what SWIFT is. It's the most efficient, dependable, reliable financial institution in the world. We'll just say that, right? To make things very simple. So if you want to do a financial transaction, you got to go through this toll. Well, what happens if you don't play nice with the United States anymore? Well, now you can't use that toll. Okay? You now get hit with the
denied.
And the problem with that is we could basically shut down your banks. We can sanction you. We can f up your ability to earn revenue, right? To sell your commodities, to do transactions, right? That is SWIFT, to make it simple. There's way more complex than that, but for the purposes of this discussion, so I can explain this in a very simple way, that is what SWIFT is, okay? Then obviously military might. You guys already know, we have the biggest military in the world, pretty much. We have an extremely advanced military. We have nuclear weapons, we have submarines, we have a competent air force, we have air superiority, we have all types, and we have military bases all over the world, right? So these are the four things, chat, that has made the United States the world power that it is. And it's allowed us to maintain world power dominance for a very long time. Again, the petrodollar, reserve currency status, SWIFT, and our military. Now, like I said before, these four things are being challenged. Let's go back through it, okay? The petrodollar. Saudi Arabia no longer doing all their transactions in dollars. This came out last year, but it got buried in a news cycle. Why? Because of an election year. No one talked about it. I was one of the few people that posted on Twitter saying, yo, this isn't good. Fast forward 2 years, and we're invading Venezuela. I knew this was going to come. I knew we were going to take some type of drastic situation to combat the fact that the petrodollar isn't as strong. Next, reserve currency status. Constantly being challenged. BRICS is rising up. Less countries are using the US dollar for their transactions. They're using the yuan, they're using the ruble. Countries are trading in oil outside of the US dollar. SWIFT. Many countries are getting off of SWIFT. There are starting to become more attractive alternatives that the Chinese and the Russians are manufacturing. The Russians can't use SWIFT anymore. They got kicked out when they invaded Ukraine. And I'll tell you guys this. 2022 was the beginning to show that there can be an alternative system. When Russia bought a bunch of gold, right? And was prepared for the sanctions and getting kicked off of SWIFT. The day they invaded Ukraine, guess who was in Russia? Hemeti, the head of the RSF, Rapid Support Forces. from Sudan. He was there with a bunch of gold because the Russians knew that they were going to get kicked off SWIFT, and they knew that they were going to have to operate outside of the US dollar paradigm, right? They knew they were going to get kicked off SWIFT. They knew that they were going to need to start doing transactions in ruble. They knew that they were going to have to start selling their oil in ruble, all this other shit. And they've been fine. Despite the fact that they've been sanctioned to hell, they've been surviving. This sets a precedent, chat, that you don't need to exist in the US financial infrastructure to be successful. And that was a threat to Washington. And not only that, not only did Russia invade Ukraine, and they're still invading Ukraine, and they're still fighting and shit like that, the US has had to basically bend the knee and say, we're going to go ahead and exercise diplomacy with these guys. Despite the fact that Putin has a warrant for his arrest, despite the fact that the entire international community condemns him, despite the fact that NATO hates him. Why? Because the sanctions and getting kicked off of SWIFT did not create as much damage as they thought. And this is what's created the need and the rise for BRICS, an alternative system. Okay? So we talked about obviously the petrodollar being challenged because Saudi Arabia no longer does all their transactions in US dollars. We talked about the reserve currency status going down. Less countries are using US dollars to trade commodities internationally. Okay? More banks are buying more gold. Why do you guys think gold has been going up in price? If you guys notice that, gold has been spiking. Gold has been spiking because Trump has been issuing these tariffs. Foreign policy has been a little bit shaky, having issues with all these countries. So they're like, we don't know if we can rely on the US dollar system as much. Let's go ahead and hedge our bets. Let's go ahead and start buying some gold. BRICS has been rising. Russia's shown that you don't need to deal in dollars to be able to still make your economy thrive. Russia had the 5th strongest economy for a period of time, despite being sanctioned to hell. So they proved that you do not have to exist within the U.S. financial monster to survive, right? You can be sanctioned to hell and still operate and still have a thriving economy, which Russia proved that you can do. Tucker went over to Russia and showed this. Food is still stable priced, cheaper than America. It's not pouring up like people think, right? When Americans go over there, they're like, holy shit, it's clean, it's safe, there's no issues here, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, the American propaganda pushes out Western propaganda. Hey, Russia's evil, they're poor, blah, blah, blah. It's not true, bro. They have a very strong economy, despite the fact that they're sanctioned to hell. And then, obviously, the military might, right? Which even the military might is being a little bit, Guys, there's like 7 countries fighting against Russia right now, and they still can barely hold the line. So even our weapons technology, right, is being challenged. So all 4 pillars of American supremacy have been tested and challenged and shown that they're not impenetrable. Petrodollar, reserve currency status, SWIFT, and then the military might. Those are the 4 pillars that the United States has always